see you all. I thought this was going to be a panel discussion. I was going to be in the audience.
No. There is no concept of formal meetings here. Basically, it's just an informal get-together. About once a week at this time, I will be hanging out here online for everyone who wants to join me. And I think this very informal series of meetings is going to be useful just to offer people at least to hang out at a scheduled time to discuss the things that interest us. I have switched the recording system on so that this is going to be recorded from now on. I know that some other people are in the channel, but we see here only those who are on video. Okay, let me introduce things. I'm Giulio Prisco. Here with me we have Christopher Bradford and Lincoln Cannon, best known as members of the Mormon Transhumanist Association. We have, among many other things, of course, we have Micah Redding, best known as the main driving force behind the Christian Transhumanist Association. We have David, by the way, can you just tell me how to pronounce your surname, which is something I never understood?
Yeah, it's McFadgen.
Okay, unpronounceable. He's an old administrator of nice things like the Extropy list. And here we go. This is the first of this series of scheduled meetings. And I thought to have a general discussion on the status of the meta community of people who share our interest in, for lack of a better word, let's say spiritual and religious transhumanism. One of the things that I'd like to find out is about the conferences. Is the MTA conference and the CTA conference going to take place this year as the previous years? And if so, is it going to be a physical event or an online one? Well, I think for the MTA one, the answer is clear, but perhaps you have better luck for the CTA conference.
Yeah, so the MTA conference is going to happen this year. It will be online like it was last year. I imagine it will return to being a physical conference in 2022. That's the hope. But I don't think the pandemic has gone far enough to give us confidence in trying to do that this year. So yeah, it should be coming up here in just a few months. We should be hearing more about that from the management at the MTA. Carl Youngblood has recently been appointed as the new president and CEO of the MTA, so I imagine he'll be sharing more information about the conference soon.
So that should be in the first couple of weeks of April, I guess, as usual.
It's approximately that time. I don't think that a specific date has been communicated yet.
Well, I will make sure to attend the online event like last year. What about the CTA conference, Micah? That's later in the year, isn't it?
So we've done it in the fall, and we skipped this year because we were obviously with the pandemic and so forth. We by that point in this past year we couldn't do that, and we talked about some possibilities of doing an online version of the conference, but a lot of people felt like they were kind of overwhelmed by video conferences at that time. And so we decided to forego it last year. It's an open question still for what we'll do for this year. I know that one thing people are very interested in is more online resources and conversations and so forth. So there's still several different formats we might choose to explore for that. And each of those have different kind of pluses and minuses. And so we're still in discussion about that. But yeah, typically that would be in the fall.
And the option of having a physical conference is still open.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, by the way, I'm hearing some of your voices broken. Do you hear me okay?
Sound good to me.
Right.
Yeah, I can hear you just fine.
That's great. And could you also hear Lincoln and Micah fine?
Yes.
Yeah, because it's so if a temporary hiccup of my internet connection, which is usually good, but sometimes it decides to behave, and normally it recovers itself in a few minutes. I hope that will be the case.
Yeah, Julio, there is a small delay between your audio and video, but it's not that bad.
Right. And also for you. Okay, so what other
what I've noticed is that the background noise on some mics causes the video to switch constantly. So I think the AV would be better if we went on mute when we're not talking, and then the video would stay on the speaker for as long as you're speaking rather than switching all the time.
Yes, because that can also depend on having or not having headphones, because the audio cancellation is not always as good as it should be. In fact, I usually wear headphones to avoid that, and it's good to mute one's microphone when not speaking. So I'm going to mute my microphone for a while now and ask you guys just what's new, if there is anything very interesting happening that you want to share with us.
Sure, I'll give you an update on the status of the Mormon Transhumanist Association. That will probably be interesting to you. As you know, the MTA has now been around for 15 years. For the first 10 years, I served as its president and CEO. After that, Chris, who's here, served as president. And we had a couple of different people serve as CEO while he was president. One was Blair Osler, the other was Michael Ann Gardner. And then we transitioned to Ben Blair, who was president of the CEO, while Michael Ann was continuing to serve as CEO. Did I say he was CEO? He was president while she continued to serve as CEO. And then we've decided now to consolidate again the leadership into a single person. Carl Youngblood now has been appointed by the board of directors to be both president and CEO of the MTA just about a month ago, I guess. That decision was made, and I think that's a good decision. You know, we were exploring dividing the leadership responsibilities to try and get more people involved. You know, it's a nonprofit, and like all nonprofits, people's schedules are complicated, and we were trying to arrange ourselves to be more flexible toward that. And it really ended up causing just, I think, more difficulty for the leadership and decision making. So we've reconsolidated the president CEO roles, and probably will keep them that way going forward. But who knows? Maybe our great grandchildren will choose to do something different with it. As far as like the mission and function of the MTA are concerned, there haven't been any changes there. The mission of the MTA continues to be an advocacy mission. We advocate the principles that are espoused in the Transhumanist Declaration and the Mormon Transhumanist Affirmation. And we continue to provide forums for discussion and for awareness raising among members of the association, among the friends of the association. We do fundraisers to gather the means to engage in projects that facilitate that advocacy work. Websites and conferences. We're looking at doing more things in physical space with like books and billboards and things along those lines to try and gather additional attention. One of the strengths and opportunities of Mormon transhumanism is that we have kind of a location that is relatively concentrated for our membership. There's a lot of Mormon transhumanists in Utah, in the United States. So physical marketing techniques are actually quite effective for our purposes, for attracting new members and for communicating with existing members, whereas that's a little bit more difficult for some other religious transhumanist groups that are more spread out globally. So we're looking at possibilities of taking advantage of that. We have an election coming up soon for members of the Mormon Transhumanist Association. All voting members get to participate in selecting our board of directors. And if you aren't currently a voting member of the MTA, I encourage you to become one. You don't have to be a Mormon to be a voting member of the MTA. All you have to do is support the purpose of the association, which is to advocate the Transhumanist Declaration and the Mormon Transhumanist Affirmation. Julio is just pointing out that he's a member, even though he doesn't identify as a Mormon. I think he does identify as a Mormon transhumanist. So all are invited to participate in that, and the more the merrier. We always select better leaders when we have greater participation, when it reflects more of the voice of the membership more broadly. So I hope you'll join in that. And then we've already mentioned that we've got a conference coming up soon. The date is still pending, but the conferences of the Mormon Transhumanist Association really are they have been the leading voice of religious transhumanism for a long time. We've had extraordinary speakers from both secular transhumanism to religious transhumanists, both inside and outside of Mormonism, as well as critics of religious transhumanism, critics of Mormonism, critics of transhumanism, secular transhumanism. We've invited many very well-known people to speak and have had quite extraordinary presentations and discussions over the years, and will continue to do that. So I invite everybody to plan to attend that when the date becomes available. Put it in your calendar. Watch for that date. Other than that, I'm happy to answer any questions if any of you have them about the MTA or its plans.
I've got a question. How big is the MTA?
Sure, yeah. The MTA is currently at almost 1,000 members, just under, I believe. I don't have the exact numbers on me anymore these days. That the membership records are kept by other people, but I believe that we're just under 1,000 right now.
Do you have a sense of whether it's growing or is it stable?
Yes, it is growing. It continues to grow. For example, when I stepped down as president and CEO in 2016, we had, as I recall, 600 members, 600 or 700 members in that neighborhood. So it's not going to consume the world anytime soon, but it is growing consistently. One interesting thing I'll add on that subject.
Again, I want.
Sorry, Mike. Yeah, just one thing to add, and then I'll get back to the question you're about to ask. Among Mormon movements, it's interesting to note that Mormon transhumanism, with about 1,000 members, is actually becoming quite a significant movement. Mormonism is not a gigantic religion. There's about the same number of Mormons on earth as there are Jews. And by far the largest Mormon movement is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. In fact, most members of the MTA are also members of that church. And then the second largest would be the Community of Christ. After those two large ones, most Mormon movements are only in the thousands of people. So the fact that MTA now is crossing into the 1,000 threshold is quite significant for a movement in our religious tradition. Sorry, Micah, go ahead.
I was going to ask, you spoke to this a bit, but I was going to ask if there's a sense in which your focus as a group has changed, or your aims over time, your sense of what you're aiming for, what you hope to accomplish as a group, or maybe even in terms of like what the group definition is.
Yeah, there hasn't really been a change in our mission. The mission remains exactly the same as it has since the beginning. It's defined by our Constitution. The Constitution of the MTA lays out that the mission is to promote the Transhumanist Declaration and Mormon Transhumanist Affirmation. That's a direct quote from the Constitution. And from the beginning, we've done that. There are in each of those documents sets of principles regarding, transhumanist visions of the future, transhumanist ethics, as well as religious approaches to those expressed in the Mormon Transhumanist Affirmation. And we've done lots of work for 15 years to advocate those ideas. Along the way, we've also engaged in various projects that we believe are complementary to our advocacy efforts. But the core of our mission remains the same, and that is the advocacy itself. And to the extent that we engage in particular projects, it's because we suppose those to be helpful in our advocacy efforts on the whole.
Did you want to say something, Micah?
Yeah, sure. So the CTA, as we were talking about, had two conferences, one in 2018, one in 2019, and it's really interesting and I think a great experience of the kinds of people who are interested in this stuff. And I actually think there's a slightly different group who will come to those kinds of conferences than will actively participate online. So there's kind of an interesting idea of different communities that we can speak to and serve. And this goes to maybe a distinction between the CTA and the MTA, where the MTA is a very inclusive group, but I think is culturally focused on the ideas and the culture of Mormonism in a way that the CTA does not. Well, like Lincoln was saying, the MTA has a geographic center and and I think with that, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, but a kind of cultural center. And CTA has neither of those because it's a Christian association. So we're attempting to include people of all denominations and traditions and so forth, as well as having a membership that's quite distributed. So one thing we've done recently is that we conducted our first membership survey, and I feel like we got a good level of participation. Perhaps 10% of our members participated in that, which I think is actually good for as in-depth of a survey as we did. And we asked a lot of different questions about kind of positions on ethical issues and trying to get a sense of where our membership kind of fits in the overall scheme of things. And so we're still processing through that information and looking to, learn from that and make sense of it. But I think that's been a great exercise and hopefully yield some important insights. And one like small takeaway, I think, which these are, you have to weigh this against other stuff, but people, when they prioritize what they think religious transhumanism in general should be doing, they said, first of all, healing and extending life, and secondly, reconciling science and faith. And then there were several other things that I think people really were drawn to and so forth. But that's an interesting thing for us to reflect on as kind of a prioritization. So coming up, we also have an election, our annual board election. All voting members of the CTA are able to participate in that and run for board seats. And board terms are for 3 years on a rotating basis. So that usually provokes some interesting discussion. We get to ask people questions about their own understandings and their faith and whatever else the membership is interested in. And we usually do that in a public discussion on Facebook. So that's something we're looking forward to. Yeah, so those are some of the things kind of on the horizon. We've also started doing a monthly discussion. And so on the first Thursday of every month, we do a kind of hosted discussion by one of our board members or someone who's invited to kind of lead a discussion on a particular topic of interest to religious transhumanists. And we've been doing that for several months now, and we plan to continue to do that. And so we do that at 9 p.m. Central Time, first Thursdays of the month. And so that's something that I think we, like I said, we'll keep doing, and has been a good experience for getting to hear from different kind of corners of our community and how people are thinking through things. And yeah, I think we have a lot of opportunity to develop more online discussions and more materials around some of these concepts. And so this is something that I've been thinking a lot about, what we actually hope to produce over the longer term, over 3 years, over 5 years, that kind of scale. And so we've been around since about 7, 8 years now. So kind of thinking about what we hope to actually produce in the world that will be substantial enough to change the right conversations. So that's something that is kind of on my radar to think about. But yeah, we've got elections coming up. We've got these monthly meetings, and we continue to have great discussions online and draw new people into them.
I would like to participate in the CTA monthly meetings and also in the MTA monthly meetings. Unfortunately, 9 p.m. Central Time and something like that for the MTA meetups are, kind of in the middle of the night for me. Like, perhaps this time of the day is not very convenient for Americans. With online meetings, it's impossible to find a time that makes everyone happy. One possibility perhaps would be, to change time, like for example 1 month and at 9 p.m. and 1 month at 9 a.m. to give a chance to everyone to attend. But I guess no. I was going to say that perhaps I would be the only non-American attending the CTA online meetings, but Perhaps no. What do you think, Michael? Would you have many participants from Europe and Africa, Asia, Australia?
Yeah, so this is one of our obstacles as an international group. We are heavily focused in America, North America, but we do have people from around the world, and one of our board members is from Australia. So one of the things that we're able to do by doing evening times, it lines up with his lunch time. So we're typically able to do that. But it's a real problem because yeah, certain people in certain areas of Africa and so forth, definitely it's like the middle of the night for a lot of people, and that inhibits, I think, the ability of people um, outside of these specific areas to participate. So typically, we get much more involvement online than we do from meetings like that. So we could try to mix it up, and sometimes that'll help, sometimes it won't. So I could see us doing I could see us doing a Sunday morning thing like this. I could see working something like that in as a hope to get more people involved who might not otherwise. But yeah, that's an ongoing issue for us, trying to be appropriately globally focused and account for time zones and all that kind of stuff.
And how about you guys, Lincoln? I think your meeting is an online extension of a physical meetup, or has that also become virtual these days?
It's entirely virtual right now. It began as an online extension of a physical meetup. The timing of that meeting is unlikely to change because of our geographic center. It's the most likely time for people in our area to gather together physically to talk about the kinds of things that Mormon transhumanists like to talk about. It's a Sunday evening, basically. So people have gone to church, they've spent time with their families, and the evening approaches, their schedule's winding down, and they have some free time. Right. So I'm pretty confident that time will remain where it's at, and fortunately, that facilitates participation by many people in our geographical center. Unfortunately, that's not convenient for everybody.
And how about posting the video to YouTube after the meeting?
I believe that the management team is working on doing things like that. I know that Carl Youngblood has continued Michael and Bradley's practice of recording them. And I think the plan is to start putting them all up on the MTA YouTube channel, which of course already has tons of great content. If people aren't familiar with the MTA YouTube channel, they should check it out. It's at youtube.com/transfigurism. And we've got recordings of all of our past conferences there, many other discussions and debates and presentations are also presented there. It really is quite a treasure trove of religious transhumanist expression.
I think it's not that hard, because if you use Zoom, as I think you do, then there is an option to automatically record in the cloud and download later, which makes recording much easier than it would be otherwise. So that would be, I think, a good idea for you.
Yeah, that could facilitate the timing for sure. I think that some concern has been expressed regarding editing needs, and I'm not sure what decisions have been made along those lines, but I know I've heard some discussion about ensuring consent of everybody in the recording and removing dead space and things like that. I don't know. So I know that they're trying to weigh in both the interest in timeliness as well as the interest in the quality of the
Yes, well, I think unless it's a really very formal event like the annual conference, having a perfect quality perhaps not that important. And
yeah, I'm inclined to that direction as well. And in fact, I'll take that feedback to the MTA board for you and express it. I do know that our current president and CEO, Carl Youngblood, he is somebody who is highly concerned about quality in everything. He really is quite amazing that way, the work that he does. And sometimes that tends towards a little bit of perfectionism. Yes. And that's, of course, can be both wonderful and sometimes slower. But he's also pretty fast about what he's perfectionist about. He's an amazing person. So, but I will share your feedback with the board and with him.
Yeah, you know what they say, and I agree, is that it doesn't take a lot of work to make something good enough, but after that, it takes a hell of a lot of work to make it more than good enough, and sometimes one has to wonder whether you really want quality at all costs, especially in view of the fact that we all have so many other things to do. For example, what I am going to do with this video recording, if you guys don't object, of course, is to put it on YouTube without any editing at all. And that's what I have done for the TerraSam event that I organized in December, and that's what I always tend to do, because, you know, there are imperfections, of course, but, you know, as long as the imperfection does not make it impossible to see the people and listen to what they say, I tend not to bother about that. So, how about you, Micah? Do you put the recordings of the CTA meeting video online?
We do take recordings. So we have a backlog of video that needs to be edited and so forth, and we have some volunteers. So we're kind of slowly working through that. We also have video of these monthly meetings we've been doing, and that's probably on me to get edited and get up. So I'm not like you said, I'm just going to kind of put it up, but it does require a little bit of extraction work. So that's the plan. Get that up on YouTube so it can be shared. So we've got several different talks so far that we should have from that, and we should do that going forward. So yeah, that's the hope right now, and hopefully that'll be up soon.
I have a question for maybe both Lincoln and Mike, particularly with kind of your observations of the meetups that have been happening in the last several months. And that is, in both the Christian tradition and the Mormon tradition, eschatology tends to play a fairly large role. And this past year, has had a lot of upheaval, pandemic, climate change, political trends, especially in the Western world. I'm curious whether you've seen an increase in eschatological themes or views expressed, and how that kind of ties into a transhumanist response, and particularly a religious transhumanist response.
You want to start, Micah? Sounds like Micah wants me to start. Yeah, for sure. I think that all religious people, if they if you are involved in any religious circles, either as a religious person or as a non-religious observer, I don't think you could help but see an increase in eschatological thinking and action this year. It's been in some ways alarming, in some ways intriguing. From a religious transhumanist perspective, I think that there are important contributions that we can and should make in discussions about, about fears and, in some cases, sadly, hopes for the end of the world. Predominantly, what we should be doing is we should be helping people understand that our visions of the future are ultimately beautiful and compassionate and pro-social, that our visions of the future are concerned with building up human potential and human relations, and that our visions of the future are invariably, among transhumanists, among religious transhumanists, our visions of the future are things that we should participate in actively. We aren't waiting for God to do everything for us. We trust in grace, and part of our trust in grace is that God has graced us with means to act and to participate in the world and its unfolding, in the creation and its unfolding, in the potential of humanity and its unfolding, that we are called to participate in that work, in that endeavor. And so we have a responsibility to respond to difficult times in ways that build each other up rather than tear each other down. There's such an opportunity to take scripture, whether it's Christian scripture or Hindu scripture or any other religious tradition. There's such an opportunity to take that and interpret it in escapist or destructive or nihilistic ways, and to act or sit on our hands and not act at all in ways that further separation and further laziness and further ignorance and further superstition. In contrast, we can choose and have solid grounds from our scriptures to act in ways that are exactly the opposite of that. In fact, I'd argue that our scriptures provide much more solid grounds for not being escapist and not being nihilistic and not being destructive. Our scriptures provide solid grounds for trusting in a day of transfiguration, when humans will be changed in the twinkling of an eye, as St. Paul puts it in the Bible, from mortality to immortality. That we should have faith that's expressed in our works, in our actions, as St. James expresses it in his epistle in the New Testament. That it's not enough to say that we have faith in God or in Christ, but that we should act on that faith. It's not enough to say, hey, there's a naked person, or hey, there's a hungry person. Be fed, be clothed. It's not enough to just say pretty things. We actually have to do beautiful things. We actually have to feed them and clothe them. We actually have to act. We actually have to work toward the world that we hope for. And a lot of people, when they think about the eschatology, their mind races towards some of the frightening prophecies that they can read about in the Bible, for example, in the book of Revelation, and they think, well, God has already told us that the end has to be horrible and terrible and frightening. Well, that's not the whole story of the Bible, and that's not the function. That's demonstrably not the function of prophecy in the Bible, just to frighten us into doing nothing and just like inevitably accept our collapse. A great counterexample to such an attitude comes from the story of Jonah from the Old Testament, where Jonah is told by God to go talk to Nineveh and tell them, you will be destroyed. The story doesn't say that Jonah gives them any qualification on that prophecy. It just says, God told me to tell you you're going to be destroyed. And after the part with the fish, Jonah goes and does what God commanded Jonah to do. And Jonah says, Nineveh, you're going to be destroyed. And Nineveh, what do? They don't sit on their hands. They don't, forlorn their inevitable fate. What they do is they repent and they change. And God doesn't destroy them. And guess what happens? Well, like many religious fundamentalists, Jonah becomes angry at God because the prophecy wasn't fulfilled. And God has to point out to Jonah, listen, the point wasn't to destroy them. And it's kind of funny how God points that out. God says, hey, there's a lot of good cattle there, or something like that. But the practical upshoot of God's point in this story is that the point isn't the destruction. The point of prophecy isn't our destruction. The point of prophecy isn't fate. The point of prophecy is to promote and to provoke change, positive change. And so we should look at the revelations, the visions, the ideas of the future that we receive from our religious traditions and ask ourselves, what can we do with them practically to promote positive change? If we do that, then we're using them in accordance with their original purpose.
Yeah. So I think this is definitely a time where, yeah, a lot of apocalyptic things are on people's minds. I think one thing we've seen. So one of the recent discussions was on the topic of how transhumanism can fight fascism, right? So we have like a lot of very even practical concerns in a sense about our world right now. And I think one thing we've seen over the last several years, it feels to me like in the transhumanist movement at large, but is a move from kind of uncomplicated uh, optimism about where things are going to a more complicated uh, feeling about it, right? Feeling that, oh, there are some big disasters we need to work to avoid here. And so that is, I think, as Lincoln said, part of the function of apocalyptic language is to help us to contemplate possible futures and concerns that are looming, and to steer away from those and towards the good ones, right? Towards the good futures. So I think that concern is looming large, and it provokes not a pessimism, but a legitimate like contemplation about the really negative possibilities that do lie out there, right? So generally speaking, stepping back a bit, the Christian tradition has expressed its eschatology in three primary ways. One of which is premillennialism, postmillennialism, and amillennialism. And basically, those correlate with extreme pessimism, extreme optimism, and ambiguity about the future. And so we see early American history, for example, and early in the scientific revolution, it's dominated by postmillennialists, extreme optimists, who say this is where the future is going, this is what God is doing in the world, and we're participating in it. And that is the dominant paradigm that shapes the modern scientific revolution and so forth. What happens over the course of American history and world history is that we go through things like the Civil War in the United States, and then we go through World War I and World War II and the Cold War. And during this time, most, and I don't know numbers, but many of these people who were post-millennialists, who were having an extremely positive view of the future, kind of default positive, switched to being premillennialists, which is default negative. And this is probably the primary voice we associate with American fundamentalism, right? This extreme negativity about our future and about our potential that calls us to avoid the future and actually go back to some kind of past, right? So that comes out in a lot of American fundamentalist movements, and we've seen that on display in some big ways in recent weeks even, and because it leads to really destructive actions. Now those movements have been concerned about transhumanist possibilities for a long time, but in a very negative way, right? And so they're concerned about things like a chip, a microchip will be the mark of the beast, that kind of stuff, right? And that's an expression of that extreme pessimistic way of thinking about eschatology. And a kind of scary statistic or disappointing statistic is that when we did our first conference in 2018 for the CTA, I think we had about 130 people, 133 people in attendance, and I think it was the same weekend, maybe a week before or after, there was another conference on Christianity and transhumanism going on from an extreme negative point of view, right? These people specifically called me out as helping to usher in the Antichrist, and they were like, this group, we planned our conference before I even knew about their conference, but they were like, oh, they're trying to like preempt us or something like this. But they were doing this thing, extreme pessimism, and they had, I want to say Hugo de Garis spoke there. So they're engaged in this secular transhumanist discussion a bit as well. And they had 3,000 people at their conference. And so because fear sells, right? Like fear, and that is what they were selling, extreme fear, right? We were selling a nuanced and hopeful, version of many of these things that I don't think was like naive or anything like that, but this extreme fear like has a big market for it. Now that that movement by default has self-selected out of the CTA, right? There are almost none of those kinds of people who actively engage us or anything because we're dangerous, right? From their perspective, we're dangerous. Now, the funny thing is we actually represent the mainstream of Christian tradition while they represent a historic fringe. And so the...
but they are orthodox.
The primary, like... they think they are, but they are not. So we actually, like, some of our most represented, Christian groups include like Catholicism and so forth. And these are historically much more nuanced in their eschatology, right? They don't go in for this kind of like extreme eschatological fear. And so the mainstream of the Christian tradition, when you look at like Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, these huge churches, and then you look at the kind of mainstream of actually Protestantism in general, actually steer hard away from this. But these kind of fringe groups get a lot of attention in these circles. So most of our people, I think, have self-selected to be amillennial and postmillennial, and I would say the majority of them are actually amillennial because they have they're influenced by the concern that, okay, there are real risks that we do need to avoid. We don't have a guaranteed out of those, right? So postmillennialism kind of leans into sometimes dangerously saying, we don't have to worry. We just need to rush in and take over everything and everything will be good, right? And amillennialism says, no, it's not that simple. We need to have some disciplined humility. We need to, recognize that there are a lot of uncertainties and things like that. And I think that's where the majority of our membership actually is. And, but those amillennial visions that we kind of, I think the majority of us draw from are ones about cultivating the world and about helping to cultivate the cosmos, right? And so some of the most influential people that we see popping up, I think, are explicitly about that. Like, this is the the aim of God with the people of God is to renew the world, renew the cosmos. That's our future, and we are going to have to deal with crises along the way, and they're not predictable. We have to deal with them as they come. But the ultimate aim is for the renewal of the world, the healing of all creation, and so forth. And so that's a positive eschatology, but it's a positive eschatology that calls us to look at real risks and actually like work to kind of mitigate those risks and take positive actions in the meantime.
That's a very interesting point. In fact, I like to consider myself among the post-millennialists who try to practice what you call the extreme eschatological optimism, which is what Christianity is all about, I believe. I think one has to be optimist. One has to force himself to be optimist even when things don't seem to give too much of a reason for optimism. Because, if you are not optimist about what you will find at the end of the road, then you don't have enough of an incentive to walk along the road to get to the end. And this does not mean ignoring the problems and all the many misadventures that can happen on the road. In fact, from my point of view, extreme eschatological optimism and hope in the eventual universal resurrection and renewal of physical reality, that's what really gives me the energy to get out of bed in the morning and try to do something good. In fact, this resonates very much with two books that I was already familiar with, but I'm reading again. And one is Surprised by Hope by N.T. Wright, that I remember you, Mike, recommended to me a few years ago. And the other is by John Polkinghorne, which is a physicist and an ordained theologian, which is called The God of Hope and the End of the World. And this is the message of these two books, that Christianity really promises wonderful things, but it also requires you as a believer to work for these wonderful things to come true. And this, I think, is the synthesis between an eschatology oriented to the far future and an eschatology oriented to the world here and now. And I'm sure the two focuses can very well coexist, and as a matter of fact, should coexist.
Julio, I think that you point out an important distinction between what some people might consider optimism and what actually substantial optimism ought to be. There's a kind of pseudo-optimism that's so sure about a positive outcome that it doesn't do anything. It sits on its hands and does nothing because it's so confident that God has it all under control, right? And what that actually is simultaneously an extreme pessimism towards our capacity to matter in any way. And so a robust, true, pervasive optimism will be one that is confident that good things can happen because I can participate, because you can participate, because God can participate, because we all can and ought to participate in making good things happen. A robust optimism needs to be generalized, not concentrated into the hands of just me, that's egotism, or just God, that's escapism. We all ought to participate in a robust optimism.
I agree with this 100%. And the fact that when you see all the discussions about divine action and exactly how God operates in the world, there are many interesting ideas. And of course, God can operate in the world in many different ways. For example, by tweaking fundamental processes of physics and all that. But what I believe is that one of the ways in which God prefers to operate in the world is to go through us. And in this sense, we are the instruments of God, and good things cannot happen without our own active involvement. I like this theology very much because it's the theology that persuades one to get out of bed in the morning and do within the limits of one's possibilities something good.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, one thing I think, one way that we talk about this in Christianity is we talk about we frame this in terms of something like building for the kingdom of God, something like that. So what this actually means is that we know what we can do, or we know that we can do, and we can act, and we can contribute. We also know that there is more that has to happen in order for things to go well, right? And we always know that we will be one part of that process, not the whole process, right? So yeah, it's not egotism. We recognize that there are larger things that have to ultimately come together in order for good outcomes, but we can choose to act towards those positive outcomes in the present. And in fact, this is very theologically important, because the question is, well, what are the outcomes that we're seeking? What are the outcomes that God is seeking? And the biggest outcome that God is seeking is to involve us in this process. And so and that in fact, that participating in that process is our salvation, right? That is the substance of what salvation is. And so it's not that God is going to swoop in and save us so much as that God, by inviting us into that action, allows us to, allows us to be saved, or grants us salvation by allowing us to participate. And you actually see this in the biblical story quite large. You see in the story of Moses and the Israelites parting the Red Sea, right? This is the like central kind of narrative of the Hebrew Bible, and becomes the foundation of the Christian Bible, is this idea of God bringing people out of slavery into freedom and agency and participation in a creative community and a creative relationship with the physical world, and with living in this a law-based order rather than an authoritarian order, all this kind of stuff. And the central story, or the central image, is Moses and the Israelites standing at the Red Sea, and God says, okay, they've got danger behind them, and they've got opportunity ahead, but they can't see how to get across this barrier, the barrier of the sea that's in front of them. And so God says, interestingly, he says to Moses, stretch out your hand and part the sea. So Moses stretches out his hand, and then God sends a wind, and the sea parts. And so you would say, well, couldn't God just have parted the sea on his own, right? But that's not what God's trying to do. God is not trying to just solve all their problems. He's actually trying to invite humans into this creative agency that they are supposed to be involved in. And it's a creative process that involves the natural world, right? So God, humans, and the natural world are connected in this process of salvation, right? And so from a Christian perspective, theological perspective, we want to say that's the work of God. And yet the work of God, which is wholly credited to God, yet nevertheless is the work of working through humans, working through the natural world to bring that salvation. And in a sense, the Israelite salvation and Moses' salvation is the ability to participate in that. And I think this is all through the biblical understanding of what humans are, from Genesis on. This idea that what Moses is doing in that moment is, in essence, what humanity was created to do, to live in that kind of relationship with God and the natural world, bringing forth righteousness and freedom and justice and salvation.
Micah, I love those thoughts. I think this discussion about the relationship between God and humanity actually feeds into a very important contemporary concern with current events, and that is the decentralization of power. We see throughout the scriptures that God is decentralizing power, always pulling humanity up in power, and not just one person in humanity. God is seeking to distribute that power throughout, ultimately expressed, I think, best by Paul's description of the body of Christ as requiring all of its members. The head cannot say to the foot that it doesn't have need. They don't have need of each other. And right now we're struggling with all kinds of risks. And some people want to resort to a heavy-handed authoritarianism to solve those problems. And while that may be contextually necessary, and unfortunately so, I don't think that anyone on either side of that question should allow themselves to think that centralized authority is the ultimate solution. To the contrary, centralized authority is the ultimate risk. It's the ultimate risk in every area, but particularly in technology. The idea of concentrating technological power into a singleton should terrify all of us. That would ultimately, at some point, some way or another, I guarantee it, result in the destruction of humanity. It will. The only trustworthy way forward is for us to cultivate decentralization of technological power. And the reasons for that are complex and in some cases a little bit academic maybe, but the gist of it is that when we operate in a decentralized context, we're all required to cooperate. And at its limit, cooperation becomes practically indistinguishable from compassion. This is the kind of world we want to live in, and the best way to cultivate it is by decentralizing power, to be involved in that, to be encouraging it, to do it ourselves, to help others want to do it, to find incentivizing pathways for making that happen. It's so important for our future.
This is a very good point, I believe. But there is a point that I want to make, that centralization of power is actually our fault. It is my fault, it is your fault, and everyone. Now, if you think of the history of the internet that we have all seen in the last 30 years, in fact, the internet is a very simple system that exhibits some of the features of a much more complex system, which is the real world. So what happened in the internet? We are saying that it should be decentralized, but some of us forget that the internet was pretty much decentralized, like 20 years ago. How do things work? It worked that instead of a few giant service providers, we had many small service providers, and we paid for them, we paid money for them. I used to pay money for a mailbox, I used to pay for an independent ISP. I used to pay for a lot of things. Now what happened? It happened that reality demonstrated that this is a winner takes all market, And the internet became de facto dominated by Facebook and Google and Apple and Microsoft and Amazon. Did I miss any giant? And Twitter, of course. And I think this is our fault, because we gave up decentralization for convenience, which in other words mean that we gave up freedom for convenience, as it does happen almost always. Now, the internet was decentralized, and it should be decentralized again. I think the only technological solution to decentralization that could work now is if the internet as a whole became something like a BitTorrent. And there are interesting research and developments in that direction, but at the end of the day, technology is not the most important thing. If they develop something extremely smart and we as users don't use it because it's too difficult, or because maybe it costs money, or because it's not as immediate as Facebook, then you can have the best technology in the world. But if that technology is not used, then it's not the best technology in the world. So it's not as much a technology development issues, but it is very much an issue that concerns all of us. I would like to become less dependent on Google and Facebook and these things. For example, this experiment that I'm doing now is meant to see if we can have the same things that we get from the tech giants with more independent tools. But I think the technology is here, or the technology could be here with some more development work. But then it's up to us to say no to centralization and yes to decentralization.
Thanks, everybody, and thanks, Julia, for hosting. I'm being called to dinner. Well,
right. In
have
fact,
an enjoyable day or evening.
Right. In
Good to
fact,
see you, Chris.
yes,
Likewise.
let's stop this now. There is one question I have for you all. How was the sound and the video on your side? So you
It's
say
fine.
so.
There's
It was good for you,
a bit of a delay, but
and good for you.
it's
It
fine.
was not that good for me, but it improved at a certain moment. But now I'm going to do experiment to stop the recording, and I want to see if things improve a little bit. In fact, I stop the recording.